Hi everyone, this is the video recording of what is the content for social psychology for week number 5. So first of all, my apologies for not being able to give this lecture live, but hopefully the consolation prize of being able to listen to it in your pajamas with popcorn will outweigh that. So, the topic for today is attitudes and persuasion. So last week we looked at, or over the last few weeks, we've been looking at models of attitudes as they relate to social attitudes towards social groups. Whereas today we're going to be looking more broadly at attitudes. So it could be attitudes towards things. The same principles apply for attitudes towards groups of people. So attitudes and persuasion are the two topics today. So how can we persuade people to change their attitudes from preferring Coke to preferring Pepsi, these sorts of things. So for quite a large amount of people who finish with a psychology degree that don't go on to become psychologists, either end up going into some form of human resources management or some kind of advertising or public relations. So for the people who are interested in the advertising, marketing, public relations type of stuff, today's lecture content is going to be quite relevant for you. Okay, so what I'm going to do is this, rather than having one giant 2 hour or hour and a half YouTube, is I'm going to record this probably in groups of 3. So the first section is going to be on different models of attitudes. And this is, first of all, of course, we'll talk about some definitions and some issues around terminology. And then we'll discuss attitude formation, or how we acquire attitudes. So this is acquiring new attitudes rather than changing attitudes, which will fall under the persuasion section of today's stuff. And then we're going to talk about the link between attitude and behaviors. So for a long time, the original theories thought that attitudes quite easily predicted behavior. So if I don't like the smell of cigarettes, I will walk away from people who are smoking. Right? But a lot of evidence has come out since then that shows that link is not as simplistic as we might think. And rather than assuming that the link is there, the research now focuses on when that link appears. So under certain conditions, there'll be a link between attitude and behavior, and in others there won't. So for example, even though I might not like smoking, I probably wouldn't tell a stranger that smoking is bad for their health and that they shouldn't do it. Unless, I have a newborn child with me or something like this. So there are certain conditions or certain circumstances under which we will express or which behaviors will be guided by our attitudes. Right, so once we've talked about the attitude-behavior link and the idea that doesn't really exist in the way we would like, we'll have a quick talk about current approaches from a theoretical perspective. So I just have a few announcements here. The first assignment is due on this Wednesday coming. So if you've got any questions about that, the normal consultation hour won't be around, but I'll be answering questions by email. And I will be back on campus on Tuesday afternoon, but not till about 3 p.m, which is starting to get quite late. So emails are great. Okay, so some definitions. From the textbook, attitudes are defined as a positive, negative, or mixed reaction to a person, object, or idea. Right, so we talk about having this reaction to what we call an attitude object. So when we say that it's attitude hyphen object, and this refers to anything, it could be towards a group of specific people, it could be towards a religious belief, it could be towards a political concept, any idea, any person, or any object. Right, and so an important part of this evaluation that's worth noting is that it's quite a generous description, right? It's just talking about any reaction to anything, right? So does this include events or situations or behaviors? And, arguably, yes. The other thing that's worth noting is that this definition actually doesn't comprise any form of description of the link that the attitude has to the behavior, right? So it's just simply words like, I hate skateboarders, right? But it doesn't say anything like, I hate skateboarders, so I don't ride one, right? Or it doesn't say, I love chocolate, so I eat it, right? So at this point, I'm just going to start to throw it out there that we can have an attitude towards something like loving chocolate, but the behavior doesn't link to it, like not eating it if we're dieting. Okay, so that's the idea of attitude objects. The first thing that I wanted to really throw out there is that we can have two types of reactions towards any attitude object. And the first dimension that we can have an attitude on is our positive reaction. So we can have a high or low positive reaction to something, and we can have a high or low negative reaction to something. And these two things are separate. Typically they're related, but not always. So the easiest example that I can give you here is if you have a positive reaction to something that's quite strong, and towards that same thing you have a low negative reaction, you would have what we would call a positive attitude, right? So if I'm talking about, my favorite Cadbury dairy snack block of chocolate, I have quite a high amount of positive reaction towards that, and I have next to no negative reactions. So we can talk about my attitude as being a positive attitude towards that attitude object. The flip side of that is something that you don't like. So you would have high negative reactions towards something and low positive reactions, and we would call that a negative attitude. Harder to conceptualize is the idea of having a low positive reaction and a low negative reaction to something, right? And when this happens, so for example, if people ask me what I thought about last night's episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians, I don't have any kind of reaction. I don't have a positive reaction or a negative reaction. So we would say that towards the Kardashians, I have an indifferent attitude. And then the final of these four combinations is when you are high on both, right? So when you have a high positive reaction to something at the same time as a high negative reaction to something. And this is what we call an ambivalent attitude. An ambivalent attitude. So that goes against a little bit what we sort of think about in our pop vernacular when we talk about an ambivalent attitude. Makes it sound like we kind of don't care either way, but that's not true. We have strong reactions in both directions. Right, so the point of bringing up this model before we talk about it a little bit more is that attitudes as just reactions to something are more complex than just a simple positive to negative evaluation. So we can't think of it as being a unidimensional thing from positive to negative. We have to consider that you can have both at the same time. Right, so I'm going to give you some examples because this is really quite a hard thing to get into your head, that you can have an ambivalent attitude towards something. So the question here is, can you really have a positive and negative reaction to the same attitude object? And so maybe one easy example here is people's relationships with cars. Right, so you can really, really love your car and love talking about cars and love talking about the mechanics of cars, talking about the different types of cars there are. But you can also hate your car at the same time. If it stops working, if it's constantly letting you down, if you've recently been in a car accident, you might feel positive around cars, but also negative specifically about certain cars, certain types of cars. Or you might love talking about the design of cars, but not be able to afford it. These sorts of things. So that's one example of how you could have positive and negative reactions towards the same attitude object, or an ambivalent attitude. Right. Another example is dogs. Some people really love the idea of having a dog or a pet or a puppy, maybe, rather than a dog. But, this is one example of a great example, actually, of a type of attitude object that can be a love-hate relationship. So you can love having a puppy dog that's, cute and will play fetch with you, but then when he comes home and throws up on the carpet or eats all of your dinner, you can have negative reactions at the same time. I think this is quite well exemplified by the lead character here in Beethoven, the movie. Another great example is blood donation. Right, so we can have quite a negative reaction to the idea of blood donation because of the idea of a needle being injected, being put into you, or because of the blood coming out of you. But at the same time, you can be really well aware that it's a great cause. It's necessary for our society to have people donating blood. Right, so we can have a positive reaction and a negative reaction towards it at the same time. And the final example that I have of this, probably my favorite, is the idea of the dentist as a person, right? The social category of dentists. We are aware that they are completely necessary, angels wearing medical aprons, fixing our dental hygiene, but at the same time we can be terrified of them and actually be quite petrified with fear at the thought of having to go to a dentist. Right, so all of these are great examples of ambivalent attitudes. So at this point, we can start to think about having positive and negative reactions to the same things, and how do we manage that? So how do we manage knowing that it's good for us to go to the dentist, even though we're terrified of them? What are we going to do? Right, so I just have this dot points here. Apathetic attitudes probably cause little discomfort to everyone because they're low intensity reactions. So if you don't care about the Kardashians and the person sitting next to you at work is talking about the Kardashians all the time, it's of little discomfort to you, right? So the opposite of that, though, is that ambivalent attitudes, being high in both positive and negative reactions, can cause considerable confusion, right? And it's particularly confusing in terms of how and when it relates to behaviors, which of course as psychologists is what we're really interested in. So quick flashback to our ABC model of attitudes from last week. So we'll start with the C of the ABC, and the C component of attitudes is the cognitive components. Right, so this is the made up, it's comprised of the thoughts and beliefs that you hold about the attitude object. And these can be true or false, they can be stereotypical or counter-stereotypical. You could share them with lots of people, or they could be your own cognitive thoughts around the attitude object. Right, so in the instance of social attitudes, or attitudes towards social groups, we would call this the stereotypes component. The A of the ABC model is the affective component, or the emotional feelings that you get when you react to the attitude object. And then the B is the behavioral component, right? And this is a predisposition that we might have to act in response to a certain attitude object. So for example, a racist person's behavioral component of their attitudes would be to cross the street when they see a member of that ethnic group coming towards them. Right, so in this week's content on attitudes and behavior and of persuasion, the behavioral component becomes particularly important. So 3 other terms that are related to these that we touched on really, really briefly last week, but I think warrant a revisit, are the idea of accessibility, salience, and applicability. So we'll just do one of these at a time each. So accessibility is the idea of how close to the front of your mind is that attitude. So I like to conceptualize this as kind of like a filing drawer, like a file cabinet. Some things are close towards the front of the drawer, so when you open up the drawer, you can find it really easily. Others are deep somewhere in the back, and they're there still, but you need a little bit of time. Or maybe it's more useful to think about it in terms of you need a bit more energy to get those attitudes. So, for example, lots of political attitudes are really accessible to us most of the time because they're constantly in the media, we're constantly talking about them, we're being asked to vote on them. So this one's a little bit out of date now, but if I ask you about your attitudes towards carbon tax or refugees or marriage equality, you will probably have an easily accessible attitude in one direction or the other, and irrelevant to which way the attitude is, positive or negative or ambivalent or indifferent, it will be easily accessible, right? Others, not so much. So my favorite example of this is red licorice. If I ask you to think about your reactions to red licorice, you probably would go, and you'd get the attitude eventually, but you just need a little bit more time or a little bit more cognitive effort to get to it. Right, so it's there. We already have attitudes formed about everything, but how accessible it is different. Closely related, but still markedly different, is the idea of salience, or we can also call it noticeability. Right, so a salient thing is easily noticeable. So direct experience is one of the things that best leads to salience. So something that you have direct experience with is going to be really salient. So for example, I grew up in a part of Australia where there were water restrictions. And so my attitudes towards water consumption, or maybe more specifically water wastage, are really salient. I really notice them quite easily, right? And so salience and accessibility are usually quite closely related, but there might be some time that goes past where I don't think about water consumption or water wastage, and so the attitude might become less accessible, but it's still really salient. When I see someone, washing their car on the driveway, it's really salient to me. Cool. There's also the idea of personal consequence. So the idea of like attitudes towards spending lots of money on an earthquake resisting house, for example, might be less salient to anyone who grew up in Australia. But, you know, some people in our class might have grown up in New Zealand where earthquakes are much more common. And so personal relevance or the idea of personal consequence would make attitudes towards that much more salient for them. There's also the idea of our own needs. So, you know, we can have attitudes towards water consumption that might differ if we know that we smell. If we know that we've been to the gym, or if we've had a particularly stressful day, we might have perspired, and that could lead to some kind of odor. So our own needs might lead to differential ideas of salience around attitudes. Cool. And then the third thing that we were going to talk about is applicability, or the utility of the attitudes. So that example that I just had there that flashed up very, very quickly, I'm just going to do it once more so you can see someone drinking beer and it says is less than, and it was someone buying environmentally friendly laundry powder or dishwashing powder or something. And so the idea of this is you might not, still about water consumption. So we need a lot of water to make one glass of beer. I think it's something like 4 times the amount of water to make the amount of beer that you want to drink. So because we need to wash our clothes or wash the dishes, we probably would have attitudes that are better towards using water for that end than towards making beer. Potentially, depends on the situation and your personal preferences. But this is one example of the utility of the attitude. Cool, and so the reason that I brought these things up is that all 3 of them, this is true for, but in particular, salience produces a greater congruency of the attitude-behavior link. Right. So what that means is that the salience and the accessibility and the applicability of the attitude produces a greater attitude-behavior consistency, which in turn strengthens the attitude because we reinforce it through then attitude-behavior consistency. Right. So produces a greater consistency in our mind between our attitudes and our behaviors, and then the attitudes can lead to the behaviors and then we get reinforced. Okay, so quick recap from last week. When we're talking about attitudes, we're talking about evaluations of an attitude object which are automatic and immediate. So I think I said this in the same way. If I ask you just to look at that combination of letters up in the top left-hand corner of your screen right now, you automatically and immediately will read that as the word attitude. You can't stop yourself from doing it. And so the same thing happens with attitudes. If I ask you to think about broccoli, you can't help but immediately have some kind of an evaluative reaction or an attitude formed about that attitude object. So it's automatic and it's immediate, and it's informed by your personal tendency to form strong or weak impressions. Right? And so we can think about this as being an individual difference in our need for evaluation. Right? So some people are naturally high in a need for evaluating things, and other people are just a bit more chilled out about things, more carefree, and they have what we call a low need for evaluation. Right? And so at this point, I'm just going to throw it out there that it's really easy to predict what types of people or who will have attitudes, who is going to have a strong attitude towards something or a weak attitude towards something. So it's really easy for us to pick the opinionated people, but it's actually quite difficult to predict which way they're going to go. Right? So, for example, you might know someone who is a hardcore liberal supporter, and you would characterize them as being quite opinionated about things, probably quite conservative on economic and social political issues, but then they might be suddenly and unexpectedly really pro-marriage equality, for example. Right? So it's probably easy to predict that they will be strongly opinionated on marriage equality, but which way the attitude is, positive or negative or ambivalent, is harder to predict. Cool. So one source of evidence we have about this comes from biological predispositions research, and most of this goes by comparing siblings who are fraternal or identical twins to those who are just genetically related, so normal siblings. And this allows us to estimate the genetic contribution towards certain attitudes. So the kinds of things that it's particularly good at predicting are things like our political orientations in terms of how we'd vote, sexual preferences in terms of sexual orientation and other sexual things, such as condom use, religious attitudes, levels of religiosity, and the really good one that we can predict really, really well from genetics is support for or against the death penalty, and also for corporal punishment. So, training your children, teaching your children using discipline that might involve spanking, for example. Cool. So now we're going to talk about acquiring new attitudes. So there's a few different ways we can do this. We're going to think about it from as psychological a perspective as we can. So the first is direct instruction. So we can be communicated to have new attitudes, or trained to have new attitudes. So this picture here should hopefully very clearly bring to mind the idea of Pavlov and his dog. So classical conditioning. So we don't, I won't need to go into much detail about this. If this doesn't ring any bells to you, I would suggest that you jump on YouTube and have a quick search for Pavlov's dogs or classical conditioning and have a quick look at how that goes. So from that same logic, we can also think of things like how we can acquire attitudes towards a new brand of car using this same kind of classical conditioning techniques, pairings of attractive women to cars that should also be desirable. Politicians are quite well trained at trying to do this. Whether or not it's effective is another story. I recently saw a very, very young and new Labour candidate at the Windsor train station with a Labrador puppy, which was a golden example. I wish I'd gotten a picture of it actually, of how we might use classical conditioning, or you could argue that it's operant conditioning. So at about the same time that classical conditioning came out of the Russian psychology field, operant conditioning came out of the American field, and in some ways they're quite similar, and in others not. So same thing, I'm not going to go into much detail because it's kind of beyond the realm of what this unit needs to cover, but if you're not familiar with operant or instrumental conditioning, have a quick look on YouTube. Another way we can acquire new attitudes is through simple social learning. Right, as a social psychologist, I'll call it social learning. Other types of psychologists might call it observational learning, but just by, as we grew up, we would have seen our parents have attitudes towards certain things. For example, if you grew up in a liberal voting household, you might become a liberal voter because you've acquired the same political attitudes through social learning. If you grew up in a household full of vegetarians or feminists or people who didn't use electricity in February, you probably would have acquired the same attitudes as the people that you grew up with, purely through social learning. Okay, another way we can need to acquire new attitudes is through the idea of cognitive dissonance, or through cognitive dissonance theory. So Leon Festinger first coined this as an idea as what happens when you have two conflicting cognitions. So one famous example of this that we always use to exemplify cognitive dissonance theory is the idea of having someone who knows that smoking is bad for them. So that would be cognition one. And cognition two is, but they really like smoking. It reduces their stress or it stops them from feeling hungry. So cognition one says smoking is bad. Cognition two says smoking is good. How do you resolve that cognitive dissonance? So cognitive dissonance is really that tension of trying to hold two competing ideas salient at the same time. And the idea is that we are motivated to reduce that cognitive dissonance, because when you feel this cognitive dissonance, if you've ever had two competing ideas, should I tell this person that, or is it better for them if I don't tell them? Should I go out tonight even though I have an exam tomorrow? But if I don't, then my friends will think that I'm lame, or whatever the case is. We do what we can to reduce that cognitive dissonance. And so usually we'll do that through using a non-representative example. So, in the case of the smoking example, I know that smoking is bad for me because all of the health people say it is, but I really like smoking. How am I going to resolve that dissonance? We might use an example, something to the effect of, but my grandmother smoked a pack a day for her entire life from the age of 6 and she was fine. She never had cancer and lived a long and healthy life. Right, so we might find a single example that can sort of counter any of the cognitive dissonance. Another example is about marijuana use. So we know that although marijuana is illegal in Australia, lots and lots of people, especially at university age, do smoke it. How do they resolve that cognitive dissonance? They would talk about the health benefits of marijuana, and they would talk about how, yeah, it's illegal, but it's better for you than alcohol and these sorts of things. The next thing that we can talk about that is really, really similar is this idea of Heide's theory of balance, or balance theory, right? It's this idea that in any triangle of attitudes, there are three things that we need to consider, and they have to be balanced. So I'm just going to move straight to the next slide. Balance theory, I'm going to use an example here where there's me and one part of the triangle, and I have this great new roommate who's just moved in, and I like them, represented by the plus sign there. But then I find out that that world's greatest roommate really likes Keeping Up with the Kardashians, this TV show to which you already know from the start of today's lecture that I am ambivalent. So that means that there's this third part of the triangle, which is questionable currently. Right, so what am I going to do about this attitude? Heide's balance theory says that there's two ways this can be resolved. One is by me deciding that, well, I like this roommate and the roommate likes the Kardashians, so I guess I should like the Kardashians. Right, the second option, sad option for the roommate, I can't control whether or not the roommate likes the Kardashians, but I can control whether I like the Kardashians and whether I like the roommate. So the second option is that in order to keep this balance, I need to dislike both of them. Right, so it would be imbalanced if there was me disliking one but not the other. Right, so in order to keep the balance, I would need to dislike both, right, in order to reduce that cognitive dissonance. A couple of other things around acquiring new attitudes, hopefully before my laptop battery dies. The idea of mere exposure, right? So this guy here, Zajonc, it's spelt Zajonc, but it's pronounced science. So science had this idea that mere exposure breeds liking. So I briefly threw this idea out there last week that, you know, this song that you don't really like or you think is quite bland, you hear it a lot, it's been on the radio for a few weeks, and suddenly you feel yourself tapping your foot along to it when it comes out on the radio. So this idea is just mere exposure alone is enough to breed liking. And the same goes with familiarity. The more you're familiar with the lyrics to a song, the more you're going to like it. It is just worth noting, though, that familiarity can also breed contempt. Familiarity also leads to fame, and then fame leads to liking if we think of it in terms of halo effects. And finally, familiarity can be the basis for subliminal advertising and product placement. So if you're ever watching a TV show and there's just a small, you know, Snickers bar in the corner of the kitchen or something, just being familiar with the colors of it is enough for us to be able to have it sort of activated in our mind, and then for it to be familiar and constantly exposed. The next thing is implicit partisanship, or the idea of just taking sides for no reason, right? So beyond any of the minimal group stuff, you might just like something because you have to have a preference for something. Also, in the notes of this lecture slide, you can read about this a bit more, but there was this study where after spending 45 seconds studying the names of people from 4 hypothetical groups, the subjects showed implicit liking and implicit identification with the group of people whose names they liked. So there was just some names that they just liked more than others, and the group that they belonged to, the participants liked that group more. The final thing that we need to talk about in terms of acquiring new attitudes is the idea of FIB, or first is best. And this is the very simple idea that we just, in a list of things, we like the thing that is first in the list. Right, and so we like for example, we like our first name more than our surname. We like people whose names start with A more than people whose names start with B. Things that we've owned for longer, we're more likely to like. Things that are first in our music playlist, we're going to like more than those that are later in the playlist. Very, very simple. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to try and talk about before my battery dies is briefly this idea of the attitude-behavior link. So I already talked at the start about this. In 1936, Lapierre did this very, very famous study. It was quite flawed, but it's famous, where he and a Chinese couple drove around America going to restaurants. And so keep in mind that in the 30s in America, the Chinese were a stigmatized minority group. And there were no social norms around not saying this. So Lapierre, a professor at Stanford, and this Chinese couple went to a bunch of restaurants and then evaluated the behavior of how they were treated. So I think they went to something like 250 restaurants across America, and there was only one restaurant that refused to serve the Chinese couple. So, on paper, that makes it sound like they were treated quite nicely. The behavior was quite nice. 6 months later, they wrote to all of the restaurants and asked them how they felt about Chinese customers, and the 92% of those restaurants said that they disliked them and would probably consider not serving a Chinese customer or a Chinese couple in their restaurant. Right, so of course this study is a little bit flawed in that it was a Stanford educated professor with a Chinese couple, and the Chinese couple were fluent in English. And it wasn't representative of the whole country, so they were just traveling up and down one side of the coast. But there is this idea that the attitudes that they would write about in response to the survey and the way they behaved were really different. Right, so this is the first idea that the attitude behavior link wasn't great. Not clearly related. So like I said at the start of this YouTube, more important than the idea of if there is a link between attitudes and behavior is when do attitudes predict behavior. And so there's these 4 things here that I'm going to suggest are important. The conditions under which the attitudes are elicited, so the importance of the attitudes, how much effort is required to get them, so the salience, so the accessibility and the utility, and the opportunity for the behavior to be enacted. Then we've got the features of the attitude, so how strong is that attitude, the accessibility and the applicability again. Individual factors, so this need for evaluation. Some people just really need their attitudes to be known, or they need to know what their attitudes are. And the motivations, and then of course the behavior itself. How difficult is it to do that behavior, and how closely does the behavior correspond with the attitude? Cool. That's it for now. I'll start the next YouTube in a second.